With characteristic Yankee boldness and ingenuity, the enemy had evidently devised a means of launching heavy land-type aircraft from carriers, and had employed this new stratagem to penetrate the Japanese defences. There were also strong indications that the attack had been planned as a one-way operation. 2 of the enemy planes were reported to have retired southward from Khitan Strait, the southern entrance of Osaka Bay, and 5 more had been sighted off the southern tip of Kyushu, flying in a southwesterly direction. The suspicion occurred to us that the enemy plan might have called for the planes to crash land at sea somewhere off Shikoku, where submarines would be waiting to pick up the crews. A similar surmise was that a Russian steamer, which had been sighted by a Japanese patrol plane 200 miles south of Cape Ashizuri, on the southwestern tip of Shikoku, had been requested to perform this rescue mission. Finally, around midnight on the 18th, the mystery of the enemy's tactics was at last unravelled. A radio message from a Japanese army unit in China reported that some of the enemy planes had crash-landed in the vicinity of Nanchang. In the raids themselves, the attacking planes had managed to get in over their targets unopposed, despite the forewarning provided by the detection of the enemy carriers. They had accomplished this feat by flying in at a dangerously low altitude, so that Japanese Army and Navy interceptors, which were on guard far overhead, completely missed them. More than the admirable skill and daring of the flyers, however, the unforeseen use of the B-25 aircraft appeared chiefly responsible for the enemy's success. Taking it for granted that shorter-range carrier planes would be used, the Air Defense Command undoubtedly estimated that there would be no attack before dawn on the 19th, when the enemy carriers would have approached within carrier plane range. Consequently, it seemed probable that full defensive precautions had not yet been put into effect when the raiders struck, thanks to the capture of some of the flyers whose planes had run out of fuel before reaching friendly bases in China. Japanese intelligence soon learned that the raid had indeed been mounted from an enemy task group. It contained only 2 carriers, Hornet and Enterprise, instead of 3, as reported by Nito Maru, and the raiders, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, had all taken off from Hornet. However, not until after the war did we learn from the American side the full story of the raid. According to this post-war account, the enemy's original plan called for the B-25 aircraft to take off in the afternoon of the 18th of April, about 500 miles off the Japanese coast, so as to reach the targets at night. Colonel Doolittle himself was to fly in ahead of his raiders and make it easier for them to find their way by dropping incendiaries on the capital. As a result of the premature detection of the task group, however, this plan had to be abandoned in favour of a daylight attack, and the launching was carried out at a considerably greater distance than had been intended. To this extent, at least, the picket line interfered with the enemy plans. A communiqué issued by Imperial General Headquarters regarding the raid announced that only slight damage had been done and that most of the attacking planes had been shot down or damaged. Later, when it was learned who had commanded the enemy air group, Headquarters spokesman sarcastically pooh-poohed the attack as not even a do-little but rather a do-nothing raid. In point of physical damage inflicted, it was true enough that the raid did not accomplish a great deal, but the same could not be said of its impact on the minds of Japan's naval leaders and its consequent influence on the course of the war at sea. From this standpoint, neither do-nothing nor do-little were accurate descriptions. On the contrary, it must be regarded as a do-much raid. The greatest importance of the do-little raid lay in its immediate effect on the controversy still going on over the combined fleet plan for an assault on Midway. Although the Naval General Staff on the 5th of April had reluctantly agreed to the operation in principle, the time of execution and other vital points were still in dispute when Colonel Doolittle's raiders successfully unloaded their bombs on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. So far as combined fleet was concerned, the raid steeled its determination to press for early execution of the operation as originally proposed. The defeat of all his precautions against an enemy carrier-borne attack on the homeland cut Admiral Yamamoto's pride to the quick, and he resolved that it must not be allowed to happen again at any cost. There must be no delay, he decided, in taking the offensive to destroy the American carrier forces and to push the defensive patrol line eastward to Midway and the western Aleutians. Nor were the implications of the Tokyo bombing lost on the Naval General Staff. Even the most vociferous opponents of the Midway plan were now hard put to deny that the threat from the east, if not greater than the potential threat from Australia, was at least more pressing and immediate. Moreover, the failure to keep the capital itself safe from attack reflected as much on the Naval General Staff as on Combined Fleet. The result was that all remaining opposition to the early June Midway attack deadline and other moot points of the Combined Fleet proposal promptly vanished, and Fleet Headquarters was enabled to proceed with the elaboration of the final plan of operations. By the end of April, this plan was completed and approved by Admiral Yamamoto. It was then formally submitted to Chief of Naval General Staff Admiral Nagano, who also gave it his prompt approval. Accordingly, on the 5th of May, Admiral Nagano, acting in the name of the Emperor, issued Imperial General Headquarters Navy Order No. 18, which briefly directed Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet to carry out the occupation of Midway Island and key points in the Western Aleutians in cooperation with the Army. Simultaneously with the issuance of this basic directive, the Army and Navy sections of Imperial General Headquarters concluded a joint central agreement regulating the terms of cooperation between the two services for the Midway invasion. Under the agreement, the Army promised to furnish a detachment of one infantry regiment, reinforced to participate in the landing operations, these troops to be withdrawn after completion of the occupation, leaving subsequent defence of the island to naval forces. Saipan was tentatively fixed as the staging point for the amphibious forces, which were to assemble there on or about the 25th of May. The agreement set no specific invasion date, but stated that the operations would begin sometime in the first 20 days of June simultaneously with operations against the Western Aleutians. The Midway operation was now definitely decided. Combined Fleet had gained its way, thanks to the unwitting assistance of Colonel Doolittle and his flyers. There still remained the formidable task of organising and preparing the fleet forces, within barely a few weeks' time, to undertake the most gigantic operation in the 70-year history of the modern Japanese Navy. The final Combined Fleet plan for the Midway operation, officially designated Operation MI by Imperial General Headquarters, was the composite product of many minds. The basic outline was largely the work of the senior operations officer, Captain Kuroshima. A theoretician given to spending long hours in meditation in his darkened cabin, he was the author of a manual laying down Combined Fleet tactical doctrine for fleet versus fleet decisive battle with battleships in the key role. Other members of the staff elaborated detailed parts of the plan, each within his special sphere of competence. Overall supervision of the drafting activities was performed by the aggressive and resourceful Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Ugaki, a consistent proponent of offensive fleet action against Hawaii. But above all, the Midway plan reflected the ideas and personality of the Navy's dominant figure and Combined Fleet's Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The task of assessing this forceful leader must necessarily be left to others more competent and better informed than myself. I only wish to put down here some random impressions and thoughts about the man as I, one of thousands of officers who served under his command, saw him. If, at the start of the Pacific War, a poll had been taken among Japanese naval officers to determine their choice of the man to lead them as Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, there is little doubt that Admiral Yamamoto would have been selected by an overwhelming majority. I am confident, too, that his supporters would have included every flying officer in the Navy. After the war, in fact, American historical investigators put such a hypothetical question to a number of ex-officers of the Japanese Naval Air Corps, including myself. Our unanimous reply was, Admiral Yamamoto. The tremendous following which Yamamoto enjoyed among the Navy's flyers stemmed from the fact that he was one of the foremost promoters of naval aviation. Though not a career aviation officer himself, he was appointed executive officer of the Kasumigura Naval Air Training Corps when still a captain, and he thereafter held a succession of important air posts. The Naval Air Corps was then in its infancy and sorely needed a strong leader and champion. Yamamoto stepped into this role with enthusiasm, bringing to the task his extraordinarily keen foresight and warm-hearted human understanding. In these early days, a flying career was not particularly attractive in view of the frequency of fatal accidents. Indeed, many of the Navy's high-ranking officers would not even set foot in an airplane if they thought that it was going to leave the ground. As recently as the late 30s, Admiral Zengo Yoshida, a classmate of Yamamoto's and then Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, adamantly refused to board a plane which his staff had made ready to fly him on an official trip. Other high-ranking officers paid lip service to the importance of naval aviation and urged young men starting their careers in the Navy to go into that branch, but their enthusiasm ended abruptly when it came to having their own sons become flying officers, or even to having their daughters marry flyers. Admiral Yamamoto was no such part-way enthusiast. His belief in aviation was sincere, and he demonstrated it by encouraging a number of his younger relatives to join the Naval Air Corps. Yamamoto's fondness for flyers did not extend to sharing one of their common failings, a weakness for alcohol. He was a teetotaler. He did, however, like games of chance, and was known to be a highly competent and daring player of bridge and poker. He would have been a gifted gambler, for he had the gambler's all-or-nothing spirit. If it were true, as many said, that the Pearl Harbor attack represented an all-or-nothing strategy, it was in keeping with Yamamoto's character, and perhaps the gambler-like boldness which inspired it was one of the chief reasons for its success. Beside his capacity to take bold, imaginative decisions, another thing that earned Yamamoto the respect and admiration of the Navy's younger officers was the fact that he exercised strong, unequivocal leadership. In this respect, he was an exception rather than the rule among the Navy's admirals. Perhaps influenced by British naval traditions, the Japanese Navy from its early days had laid great stress on instilling gentlemanly qualities in its officers. Unfortunately, however, a tendency arose to equate a lack of assertiveness and an easygoing affability with gentlemanliness, with the result that there were many bright and likable flag officers, but few real leaders and fighting commanders. The lack of real leadership manifested itself on many occasions. For example, when a fleet command or naval district held maneuvers or battle exercises, the officers usually assembled afterward for a critique. The fleet or naval district commander presided at such conferences, but it was seldom that he actively guided the discussions or offered any incisive comments. The officers consequently had little idea whether they were on the right track or not. Admiral Yamamoto was quite different. In the study conferences following combined fleet maneuvers, he took a leading part in the discussions. If some movement had been carried out improperly, he pointed it out and explained how he wanted it done in the future. He did not employ his staff officers as a brain trust, but rather as aides for executing his own policies and decisions. His clear-cut guidance left no doubt as to what these policies were, so that when his subordinates were obliged to make independent decisions, they knew exactly what course of action would correspond to the thinking of their commander-in-chief. It was these strong qualities of leadership which caused the Navy as a whole to look upon Yamamoto as the man best fitted to be its supreme commander. For in war the fate of the nation may be staked upon the outcome of a single battle, and in turn victory or defeat in battle hinges largely on the character and ability of a single individual, the commander-in-chief. This is necessarily so because only by concentrating the power of decision can unified action be assured, and without unified action, victory is impossible. It is so also because moves in battle cannot be debated around the conference table and decided by majority rule. They must be decided swiftly by the commander on the basis of his own judgment and with full realization that each move, once made, is irrevocable. To make such decisions requires extraordinary courage and self-confidence. Yamamoto had both. Yet with all the qualities which seemed to make him an incomparable supreme commander, the test of war showed that Admiral Yamamoto also had his failings. These, it seems to me, were clearly evidenced by his hasty and uncompromising insistence upon the Midway operation in the face of all the cogent arguments against it. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that his judgment in this instance was warped by his obsession about keeping Tokyo immune from air attack, and by his sense of injured pride caused by the Doolittle raid. Had these feelings not unduly swayed him, he surely would have shown greater flexibility in his thinking about future strategy. Undoubtedly, too, the haste with which Yamamoto plunged into the Midway venture was inspired by his conviction that the balance of military strength between Japan and the United States would shift in the latter's favor within 2 years at the most from the start of hostilities. Because of this pressing time factor, he felt that Japan's only hope lay in seeking a quick decision which might induce the enemy to come to terms. The move on Midway, he hoped, would force such a decision. He confided to Rear Admiral Yamaguchi and other trusted subordinates that, if he succeeded in destroying the United States Pacific Fleet in the Midway operation, he intended to press the nation's political leaders to initiate overtures for peace. Yamamoto was unquestionably correct in his judgment that it was essential to engage the enemy fleet in decisive battle at the earliest possible opportunity. Indeed, if any criticism is to be made on this score, it must be directed at his failure to act earlier toward this objective by keeping the powerful Japanese carrier striking force operating to the east after the initial assault on Pearl Harbor. At all events, the destruction of the United States Pacific Fleet was certainly a top priority task in the spring of 1942. What is open to serious question, however, is whether the occupation of Midway was either the only or the most feasible way to accomplish this goal. From the tactical standpoint, the Midway plan evidenced an adherence to the outmoded doctrine of the battleship advocates, which was difficult to reconcile with Yamamoto's supposed understanding of the role of air power. It seems strange, to say the least, that the man who conceived the carrier strike on Pearl Harbor was not quicker to institute sweeping changes in fleet organization and tactics so as to make air power the central core of the combat forces. Perhaps Yamamoto himself was afflicted with the characteristic Japanese tendency to cling to the past, or perhaps he found traditional concepts so firmly entrenched that he was powerless to effect any radical overnight change. It is often said that warfare is a succession of errors on both sides, and that victory goes to the side which makes the fewer. Admiral Yamamoto and his subordinates certainly made their share of mistakes, including some for which it is hard to find any logical explanation. But rather than place blame, it is more important for us to ponder the lessons of such mistakes and of the defeat that followed. The plan drawn up by Combined Fleet Headquarters for the Midway operation had, as pointed out earlier, two central objectives. The first and more limited objective was the seizure of Midway itself as an advance airbase to facilitate the early detection of enemy forces operating westward from the Hawaiian Islands. The second, much broader objective was to draw out the United States Pacific Fleet's remaining strength so that it could be engaged and destroyed in decisive battle. While the Doolittle raid naturally lent added weight to the first of these objectives, it was nevertheless the annihilation of the enemy fleet which was the dominant goal of the Midway operation. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff were convinced that the move against Midway, because it would pose a threat to the safety of Hawaii, would virtually compel the enemy fleet to react with all its available strength. This would set the scene for the decisive fleet engagement in the Pacific, which had been the focal point of Japanese naval strategy and of fleet training and preparation for so many years. From the standpoint of relative strength, there was every reason for confidence in a Japanese victory, if the enemy rose to the challenge. The enemy's surface combat strength, thanks to the destruction of his battleships in the Pearl Harbor attack, was limited mainly to carriers and cruisers, while Combined Fleet's striking power was even greater than at the start of hostilities. At the end of April 1942, Japan's superiority over the United States in aircraft carriers alone was nearly 3-1. Against the 4 carriers believed currently available to the U.S. Pacific Fleet Yorktown, Saratoga, Hornet, and Enterprise, Combined Fleet boasted 7 large carriers and 4 light carriers. In view of this comfortable margin of superiority, Combined Fleet decided that the objectives of the Midway operation could safely be expanded to include the simultaneous capture of key points in the Western Aleutians. Permanent occupation of these northern islands was not considered necessary, as they were thought to be of little use as air patrol bases during the greater part of the year because of weather conditions. However, Combined Fleet strategists calculated that their temporary seizure, in addition to permitting destruction of enemy military installations there, would serve to protect the northern flank of the main Japanese thrust toward Midway and act as a diversion which might throw the enemy forces off balance. The overall plan therefore called for landings on Adak, Kiska, and Attu, with the invasion forces to withdraw in mid-September before the onset of winter. To carry out this gigantic two-pronged offensive, Combined Fleet planned to commit the maximum strength that it could muster. All the combat forces were to be thrown into the campaign with the exception of parts of the submarine fleet, which were then either undergoing maintenance and repair, or engaged in commerce raiding operations in the Indian Ocean. South African waters and the Australia-New Zealand area, and some surface elements indispensable to the local defence of the southern occupied regions. Altogether, including transports, auxiliaries and air strength, the combined fleet plan called for the employment of over 200 ships, including no fewer than 11 battleships, 8 carriers, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers and 21 submarines, and approximately 700 planes. The ships participating were to consume more fuel and cover a greater mileage in this one operation than the peacetime Japanese Navy had ever done in an entire year. The task organization drawn up for the Midway operation divided this massive strength into 6 major tactical forces under the overall command of Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto. The designations and principal components of these 6 forces were Main Force Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Main Body Admiral Yamamoto, Battleships Yamato Combined Fleet Flagship, Nagato, Mutsu Light Carrier, Hōshō, 8 Type 96 bombers, Light Cruiser Sendai, 9 destroyers, seaplane carriers Chiyoda, Nishin, carrying midget submarines guard, Aleutians Screening Force Vice Admiral Shiro Takasu, battleships Hyuga Flagship, Ise Fuso, Yamashiro Light Cruisers, Oi Kitakami 12 destroyers, 1st Carrier Striking Force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a carrier group, Vice Admiral Nagumo, Carrier Division 1, Vice Admiral Nagumo, Carriers Akagi, Flagship, Kaga 42 fighters, 42 dive bombers, 51 torpedo bombers, Carrier Division 2, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, Carriers Hiryu, Flagship, Soryu 42 fighters, 42 dive bombers, 42 torpedo bombers, B Support Group, Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, battleships Haruna, Kirishima, heavy cruisers Tone, Flagship Chikumak, Screening Group, Rear Admiral Susumu Kimura, light cruiser Nagara, Flagship 11 destroyers, Midway Invasion Force, Vice Admiral Nobutaka Kondo, Invasion Force Main Body, Vice Admiral Kondo, battleships Kongo, Hiei, light carrier Zuiho, 12 fighters, 12 torpedo bombers, heavy cruisers Atago, Flagship Chokai, Miyoko, Haguro, light cruiser Yura, 8 destroyers, Close Support Group, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, heavy cruisers Kumano, Flagship Suzuya, Mikuma, Mogami 2 destroyers, Transport Group Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, 12 transports and 3 destroyer transports carrying Midway Landing Force, 5,000 troops, light cruiser Jintsu, Flagship, 10 destroyers, Seaplane Tender Group, Rear Admiral Ruitaro Fujita, Seaplane Carrier Chitose, 16 float fighters, 4 scout planes, Seaplane Carrier Kamikawa Maru, 8 float fighters, 4 scout planes, 1 destroyer and 1 patrol boat, Minesweeper Group, Captain Sadatomo Miyamoto, 4 minesweepers, 3 submarine chasers, 1 supply ship and 2 cargo ships, Northern Aleutians Force, Vice Admiral Moshiro Hosogaya, Northern Force Main Body, Vice Admiral Hosogaya, heavy cruiser Nachi, Flagship, 2 destroyers, 2nd Carrier Striking Force, Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, light carrier Ryujo, Flagship, 16 fighters, 21 torpedo bombers, Carrier Junyo, 24 fighters, 21 dive bombers, heavy cruisers, Maya Takao, 3 destroyers, Atu Invasion Force, Rear Admiral Sentaro, Omori light cruiser Abukuma, Flagship, 4 destroyers, 1 mine layer, 1 transport carrying Army Landing Force, 1,200 troops, Kiska Invasion Force, Captain Takeji Ono, light cruisers, Kiso, Flagship, Tama Auxiliary Cruiser Asaka Maru, 3 destroyers, 3 minesweepers, 2 transports carrying Naval Landing Force, 1,250 troops, Submarine Detachment, Rear Admiral Shigeaki Yamazaki, submarines I-9, Flagship, I-15, I-17, I-19, I-26, Advance Submarine Force, Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, light cruiser Katori, Flagship at Kwajalein, Submarine Squadron 3, Rear Admiral Chimaki Kono, submarine tender Yasukuni Maru, Flagship at Kwajalein, submarines I-168, I-169, I-171, I-174, I-175, Submarine Squadron 5, Rear Admiral Tadashige Daigo, submarine tender Rio de Janeiro, Maru Flagship at Kwajalein submarines, I-156, I-157, I-158, I-159, I-162, I-165, I-166C, Submarine Division 13, Captain Takaharu Miyazaki, Submarines, I-121, I-122, I-123. Shore-based Air Force, Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, Midway Expeditionary Force, Captain Chisato Morita, 36 fighters, transported by carriers, 10 land bombers at Wake, 6 flying boats at Jaluit, 24th Air Flotilla, Rear Admiral Minoru Maeda, Chitose Air Group, Captain Fujiro Ohashi, 36 fighters, 36 torpedo bombers at Kwajalein and Wake. 1st Air Group Captain Samaji Inuye, 36 fighters, 36 torpedo bombers at Aur and Watcha. 14th Air Group Captain Daizo Nakajima, 18 flying boats at Jaluit and Watcha. The carefully coordinated timetable on which these various forces were to operate was centered on N Day, the 7th of June, the date fixed for the main landing on Midway. A combination of two factors was responsible for the selection of this date. The first was the time needed to repair, overhaul and resupply the ships of the Nagumo Force and Vice Admiral Kondo's Second Fleet, which had returned to the homeland only in the latter part of April after completing their first phase missions in the southern area. Since these preparations would take several weeks, it was estimated that the invasion date could not be set earlier than the first part of June. The second factor was the need of selecting a date when there would be adequate moonlight to facilitate night movements. The 7th day of June was the last day until almost 1 month later, when the moon age would be right for the landing operations, and Combined Fleet was strongly opposed to postponing the Midway attack until July. To meet the attack deadline, the various surface forces and transport groups were to sortie between 26 and the 29th of May, the Northern Force from Ominato Naval Base, on the northern end of Honshu, and the Midway Invasion Force, except Vice Admiral Kondo's main body, from Saipan and Guam. Kondo's ships, as well as Vice Admiral Nagumo's first carrier striking force and the main force under Admiral Yamamoto, were to sortie from Hashirajima anchorage in the western inland sea and head direct for the battle area. En route, the main force was to split into its two components, Admiral Yamamoto's main body continuing toward Midway, while Vice Admiral Takasu's guard force would veer off to the northeast to screen the Aleutians' invasion. Since one of the objectives of the Aleutians' attack was to create a diversion for the main thrust against Midway, the initial blow was to be struck in the northern area. On the 4th of June, N-3, Rear Admiral Kakuta's second carrier striking force, operating as part of the Northern Force, was to launch a neutralizing airstrike against Dutch Harbor, the major enemy strongpoint in the Aleutians. The initial landings on Adak and Kiska Islands were to follow on the 6th of June, N-1. The Adak landing was to be carried out by the Attu invasion force, which was to withdraw after destroying military installations and mining the bays and harbours. It was then to carry out a landing on Attu, its main objective, on the 12th of June, N+5. The landing operations were to be screened by Kakuta's carrier striking force, Vice Admiral Hosogaya's Northern Force main body, Vice Admiral Takasu's guard force, and an element of the submarine force detached to Northern Force Command. The same general pattern of attack was to be followed against Midway. On the 5th of June, N-2, the first carrier striking force was to launch a pre-invasion airstrike on Midway from a point 250 miles northwest of the island, aimed at destroying enemy air strength, defensive installations, and any surface forces in the vicinity. On the 6th of June, N-1, Rear Admiral Fujita's seaplane tender unit was to occupy tiny Kure Island, 60 miles northwest of Midway, so that it might be used as a seaplane base for direct support of the Midway landing. While these preliminary operations were in progress, the transport group carrying the Midway landing force with its escorting naval units would move in toward the objective, and at dawn on the 7th of June, simultaneous landings would be made on Sand and Eastern Islands, which together compose Midway Atoll. Close-in support of the landing would be provided by Rear Admiral Kurita's support group of heavy cruisers, while Vice Admiral Rondo's invasion force main body would stand off to the south or southwest of Midway to screen that flank of the operation. Any major enemy fleet reaction was expected to come only after the Midway landing. Consequently, the combined fleet plan provided that by the 7th of June, the Japanese forces would move into positions of readiness for the all-important decisive battle phase of the operation. They were to remain in these positions for 7 days after the occupation of Midway, unless the enemy attacked sooner. The forces primarily relied upon to meet and crush the enemy fleet were Admiral Yamamoto's main body, Vice Admiral Takasu's guard force, Vice Admiral Nagumo's 1st Carrier Striking Force, Rear Admiral Rakuta's 2nd Carrier Striking Force, and elements of Vice Admiral Ramatsu's submarine force. These forces were to be deployed as Yamamoto Force, 600 miles northwest of Midway, Takasu Force, 500 miles north of Yamamoto Force, Nagumo Force, 300 miles east of Yamamoto Force, Kakuta Force, 300 miles east of Takasu Force. Submarine forces to establish 3 cordon lines by the 2nd of June, N-5. Alternative tactical methods were provided to meet different situations, but in general, if a substantial enemy force advanced west of 160 degrees west longitude, it was to be attacked first by the carriers and submarines, with the surface combat forces to come up and give support as circumstances might require. If the enemy advance developed north of 40 degrees north latitude, the attack was to be made by the 2nd Carrier Striking Force and 1st Submarine Squadron, supported by the Takasu Force, and if south of that line, by the 1st Carrier Striking and 3rd and 5th Submarine Groups, supported by the Yamamoto Force. However, if the enemy fleet advanced in full strength, the Japanese northern and southern forces would unite and engage it in decisive battle, the Takasu Force rejoining Admiral Yamamoto's main body, and the 1st and 2nd Carrier Striking Forces merging into one force under Vice Admiral Nagumo's command. Although the principal role in the air phases of the Midway operation was of necessity assigned to the carrier forces, Vice Admiral Tsukahara's shore-based air command was given an important supporting part. Its main strength was to redeploy to island bases in the Pacific in advance of the operation and carry out extensive searches and patrols in conjunction with the assembly and movement of the surface forces to and from the battle areas. After the occupation of Midway, part of its strength was to be based there to defend the island and conduct air patrols to the east. The shore-based air forces, however, obviously could not extend their pre-invasion searches as far as Hawaii, a full 2,000 miles distant from the nearest Japanese base at Withdrawal in the Marshall Islands. This posed a difficult and vital problem, for any important naval reaction to the Midway attack would most probably originate from the Hawaiian area, and it was therefore essential to ascertain the strength and movements of the enemy forces there just prior to the start of the invasion operations. The pre-war Japanese intelligence net in Hawaii, which had contributed so effectively to the success of the Pearl Harbor attack, was of course no longer operative. Reconnaissance by submarines or by small submarine-borne seaplanes was possible, but the former was relatively ineffective owing to the limited range of observation and easy enemy air patrol interference. While the latter was considered unlikely to succeed against an area with strong air defences such as Hawaii. As a partial solution, Combined Fleet decided to resort to a special stratagem that had already worked successfully once before. This involved the use of the Navy's newest long-range aircraft, the 31-ton Kawanishi Type 2 flying boat with a speed of 235 knots and a range of 4,000 miles. Even this range was not enough for a non-stop flight from the Marshalls to Hawaii and back, but if the big planes put down once at an unoccupied atoll along the way and refueled from submarines spotted there in advance, they could fly on to Hawaii, execute their missions, and get back to base. On the 4th of March, 2 months prior to the elaboration of the final Midway plan, this method had been successfully tried for the first time in what was known as Operation K. Taking off from Withdrawal, 2 of these flying boats had put down at French frigate Shoals, about 500 miles northwest of Hawaii, refueled from submarines waiting there, and then flown on to Oahu, where they made a night reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, dropping a few bombs for psychological effect before heading back to base. In view of the success of Operation K, Combined Fleet incorporated provision in the Midway plan for a similar reconnaissance mission. Vice Admiral Tsukahara's shore-based Air Force was to dispatch 2 Type 2 flying boats to Withdrawal in time to execute the mission between the 31st of May and the 3rd of June, east longitude date. Vice Admiral Komatsu's submarine force was to cooperate by ordering some of its Kwajalein-based submarines to French frigate shoals to refuel the planes. This lone air reconnaissance effort, however, would obviously not be enough. In addition, it would still be necessary to place considerable reliance on the submarine force to keep a continuing watch on enemy fleet movements. Combined Fleet concluded that the only effective method would be to set up submarine cordons covering the approaches toward the Midway and Aleutians invasion points. Accordingly, the Midway plan directed the submarine force to station 2 cordons of 1 squadron each to the northwest and west of Hawaii, about halfway between Hawaii and Midway, and a 3rd cordon of 1 squadron farther north toward the Aleutians, all to be in position by the 2nd of June, N-5. These cordons have already been mentioned in connection with the planned decisive battle dispositions of the Japanese forces. After the conclusion of the Midway operation, most of the forces that had operated in that area were to proceed to Truk by about the 20th of June and start preparing for the Fiji-Samoa-New Caledonia operations slated to be launched in early July. Admiral Yamamoto's main force, however, was to return to the homeland by about the same date, possibly proceeding to Truk later to support the next operations. The submarine force was to continue operating against Hawaii, employing Midway as an advance base. Most of the Aleutians forces were to return to Ominato, where they would be reassigned missions of escorting supply convoys to Midway and the Aleutians and guarding the waters east of the homeland. Such, in brief outline, was the combined fleet plan for the Midway operation. As soon as it had been issued, each of the subordinate fleet commands involved in the operation earnestly began studying and planning for its own assigned mission. These studies, however, made it readily apparent that the plan could be considered satisfactory only from the viewpoint of those who persisted in regarding the battleship, with its big guns, as the main striking force of the fleet. Despite the important roles assigned to the carrier and submarine forces, they were still to act primarily as an advance guard and shield for the battleships, softening up the enemy so that the battleships could step in to deliver the decisive blow. By the end of April, a substantial part of the naval forces which were to take part in the Midway operation were already assembled in the inland sea. Except Carrier Division 5, detached to participate in the impending invasion attempt against Port Moresby, the Nagumo force had returned to home waters on 22 and the 23rd of April, ending its long voyage from the Indian Ocean. Vice Admiral Kondo's Second Fleet, which had already reached home on the 17th of April, only to be ordered to sortie again the next day in pursuit of the enemy task force that launched the Doolittle raid, also was back in port after a futile week at sea. The focal point of the assembly of forces was Hashirajima anchorage in Hiroshima Bay. There, on board the giant combined fleet flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto and his staff were hurriedly putting the finishing touches to the Midway operation plan and organizing the start of battle preparations. The telephone cable linking the flagship with the shore hummed with a constant stream of messages as the fleet headquarters maintained close liaison with the Naval General Staff in Tokyo and made arrangements with the Kure Naval Base for ship repairs, maintenance and supply. Vice Admiral Nagumo and Vice Admiral Kondo, neither of whom had previously been consulted regarding the Midway operation, now had their first opportunity to study the combined fleet plan. So far as the First Air Fleet commander and his staff were concerned, the reaction was almost one of indifference. They seemed to care little where the next operation was directed. The Nagumo force had run up a brilliant record of achievement in the first phase operations, and the headquarters was fully confident of its ability to carry out any mission which combined fleet assigned. Beneath the headquarters level, the reception was more enthusiastic. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, Commander Carrier Division 2, had for a time advocated that the next operation be aimed at Ceylon with a view to the eventual extension of Japanese control over the whole Indian Ocean area. However, after learning of the Midway plan, he became one of its staunchest supporters. From the outset of the war, Yamaguchi, who had once served as naval attaché in Washington, had fervently believed that the United States fleet must be challenged in decisive battle at the earliest opportunity. Since this was one of the central objectives of the Midway operation, it naturally won his complete approval. As for the flying officers of the Nagumo force, they had every reason to welcome the Midway venture, for to them it meant a chance to destroy the American carrier force, which they regarded as their special foe. The attitude of Vice Admiral Kondo and his staff, however, was quite different. On the 1st of May, the Second Fleet commander boarded Yamato for his first meeting with Admiral Yamamoto since the start of the war. After a brief discussion of the first phase operations, the conversation turned to the Midway plan. Vice Admiral Kondo frankly voiced misgivings, emphasizing in particular that the assault on Midway would have to be carried out without shore-based air support, while the enemy would be able to employ not only substantial shore-based air strength, but also carrier forces which as yet had not been seriously damaged. Because of this grave disadvantage, he argued that it would be wiser to launch invasion operations against New Caledonia in order to sever the supply line between the United States and Australia. Admiral Yamamoto, however, brushed aside Kondo's objections with the assertion that the Midway plan had been agreed upon between Combined Fleet Headquarters and the Naval General Staff after careful study on both sides, and could not be changed. He added that in spite of the risks involved in the Midway operation, there was no reason to fear defeat if surprise were successfully achieved. Vice Admiral Kondo then turned to the Combined Fleet Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Ugaki, and asked if the Fleet Headquarters was not concerned over the difficulty of keeping Midway supplied after its capture. Unless this could be done, he asserted, its occupation would be pointless. To this, Ugaki's far from reassuring reply was that if it eventually became impossible to continue supplying the occupation forces, they could be evacuated after completely destroying military installations. With this, the discussion ended. It was quite apparent that Combined Fleet Headquarters, regardless of all objections, had no intention of backing down from its decision to carry out the Midway operation. After returning to his own flagship, Vice Admiral Kondo related the substance of his talks in Yamato to his Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Kazutaka Shiraishi, and Senior Staff Officer, Captain Kuranosuke Yanagisawa. Yanagisawa regretfully remarked that at the very least he would like to see the staging point for the Midway invasion forces changed from Saipan to Truk in order to lessen the danger of premature enemy discovery. Second Fleet representatives later pressed this proposal during the Combined Fleet briefing conferences on the Midway plan, but to no avail. Combined Fleet was not in the mood to accept even minor changes. On the same day that Vice Admiral Kondo communicated his doubts concerning the Midway venture to Admiral Yamamoto, Combined Fleet Headquarters initiated a 4-day series of war games designed to test various operations already planned or tentatively contemplated for the second phase of the war. Staged on board flagship Yamato under the direction of Combined Fleet Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Ugaki, the games were attended by a majority of the commanders and staff officers of the forces which were to take part in the Midway operation. Those who had returned only a short while earlier from the southern area were conspicuous by the deep tan of their complexions, a result of 6 months spent under the tropic sun. Their eyes sparkled with excitement as they assembled to study the roles they would play in the forthcoming operations. The invasion of Midway was the starting point of the games, but it was only the beginning. Not since the war games of November 1941, which had rehearsed the Pearl Harbor attack and the southern invasions, had such a grandiose program of offensive operations been tested. The overall hypothetical plan formulated by Combined Fleet Headquarters as a basis for the games was briefly as follows. In early June, the main strength of Combined Fleet will capture Midway, and a part of its strength will seize the western Aleutians. After completion of these operations, most of the battleship strength will return to the homeland and stand by, while the remainder of the Midway invasion naval forces will assemble at Truk to resume operations early in July for the capture of strategic points in New Caledonia and the Fiji Islands. The Nagumo force will then carry out airstrikes against Sydney and other points on the southeast coast of Australia. Following the above, the Nagumo force and other forces assigned to the New Caledonia-Fiji Islands operations will reassemble at Truk for replenishment. Sometime after the beginning of August, operations will be launched against Johnston Island and Hawaii, employing the full strength of Combined Fleet. Except for the staff of Combined Fleet Headquarters, all those taking part in the war games were amazed at this formidable program, which seemed to have been dreamed up with a great deal more imagination than regard for reality. Still more amazing, however, was the manner in which every operation from the invasion of Midway and the Aleutians down to the assault on Johnston and Hawaii was carried out in the games without the slightest difficulty. This was due in no small measure to the high-handed conduct of Rear Admiral Ugaki, the presiding officer, who frequently intervened to set aside rulings made by the umpires. In the tabletop maneuvers, for example, a situation developed in which the Nagumo force underwent a bombing attack by enemy land-based aircraft while its own planes were off attacking Midway. In accordance with the rules, Lieutenant Commander Okumiya, Carrier Division 4 staff officer who was acting as an umpire, cast dice to determine the bombing results and ruled that there had been 9 enemy hits on the Japanese carriers. Both Akagi and Kaga were listed as sunk. Admiral Ugaki, however, arbitrarily reduced the number of enemy hits to only 3, which resulted in Kaga's still being ruled sunk, but Akagi only slightly damaged. To Okumiya's surprise, even this revised ruling was subsequently cancelled, and Kaga reappeared as a participant in the next part of the games covering the New Caledonia and Fiji Islands invasions. The verdicts of the umpires regarding the results of airfighting were similarly juggled, always in favour of the Japanese forces. The value of the games also was impaired by the fact that the participating staff officers from several major operational commands, including the Nagumo Force and the shore-based 11th Air Fleet, had had little time to study the operations to be tested. The result was that they could only play out their parts like puppets, with the staff of Combined Fleet Headquarters pulling the strings. The lack of preparation was illustrated by an incident which occurred during the Midway invasion maneuvers. There, the somewhat reckless manner in which the Nagumo force operated evoked criticism, and the question was raised as to what plan the force had in mind to meet the contingency that an enemy carrier task force might appear on its flank while it was executing its scheduled air attack on Midway. The reply given by the Nagumo force staff officer present was so vague as to suggest that there was no such plan, and Rear Admiral Ugaki himself cautioned that greater consideration must be given to this possibility. Indeed, in the actual battle, this was precisely what happened. Following the conclusion of the war games on the 4th of May, 2 additional days were devoted to study and briefing conferences concerning the Midway operation. Various recommendations were advanced for making changes in the operational plan, but for the most part they got nowhere. In particular, almost all the participating fleet commanders from Vice Admiral Kondo on down the Une strongly urged postponement of the invasion date in order to allow more time for battle preparations. Rear Admiral Ugaki, however, asserted that this was impossible because a postponement, unless it were for an entire month, would mean that there would be inadequate moonlight for night manoeuvring off the invasion beaches. One problem raised by the staff of the Nagumo force was the inadequacy of the radio communications equipment carried by flagship Akagi. This, of course, was a weakness common to all carriers because of the necessity of keeping the radio masts small and unobtrusive so as not to interfere with the takeoff and landing of aircraft. Rear Admiral Kusaka, Chief of Staff of the Nagumo Force, pointed out during the study conferences that Akagi might fail to intercept enemy radio messages vitally important to forming an estimate of enemy movements and intentions. To remedy this, 2 alternatives were recommended. The first was that Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, instead of leading the battleship main strength, which would necessitate maintaining radio silence, should operate independently and relay all important radio intercepts to the Nagumo force. The second provided that Yamato should operate directly with the carriers, Admiral Yamamoto assuming direct command of the Nagumo force. Neither recommendation was accepted. This was only one example of the general failure of the Combined Fleet Midway plan to provide for adequate support of the Nagumo force. For air searches, the force would have to rely entirely on its own planes. To defend itself against air attack, it would have to depend largely on its own combat air patrol, because the force itself lacked enough screening units to throw up an effective barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Obviously, the battleship groups, which were to be deployed 300 miles behind the carrier forces, would be incapable of rendering any assistance in case the latter got into trouble. In fact, it was difficult for Nagumo's staff to see how the battleships, if disposed so far to the rear, would serve any useful purpose whatever in the overall operation. Basically, the trouble lay in the fact, pointed out earlier, that the Midway plan rested on the obsolete concept, still dominant in combined fleet headquarters. That battleships rather than carriers constituted the main battle strength of the fleet. Instead of employing the battleships to screen and reinforce the carriers, it was the carriers which were placed in the supporting role. The fallacy of this concept was to be driven home with tragic force. A week before the war games of 1 to the 4th of May, the need of a thoroughgoing fleet reorganization designed to place paramount emphasis on carrier air power rather than surface gun power had been strongly urged by Commander Genda and other officers of the Nagumo force at a conference held on board Yamato to review the first phase operations. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi had specifically proposed that the entire mobile surface strength of combined fleet be reorganized into 3 task fleets, each of which would have a nucleus of 3 or 4 carriers with adequate numbers of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers to screen them. Combined fleet already had plenty of screening ships, and by the latter part of 1942 was also expected to have enough carriers to form 3 such task fleets. 2 of them could be organized immediately, each well-balanced and with powerful carrier strength. Combined fleet agreed to this proposal in principle, but actually no action was taken to put it into effect prior to the Midway operation. The war games and study conferences thus ended with many officers in the operational forces dissatisfied over various aspects of the Midway plan and with numerous important problems left unsolved. Some officers privately whispered that combined fleet headquarters seemed seriously to underestimate enemy capabilities. None dared voice this accusation openly during the conferences, however, and to a considerable extent the operational commands themselves were guilty of overconfidence. This was certainly true of the Nagumo force. We were so sure of our own strength that we thought we could smash the enemy fleet single-handed, even if the battleship groups did nothing to support us. At the conclusion of the study conferences, Admiral Yamamoto called upon all combined fleet forces to devote their fullest energies to the successful prosecution of the forthcoming operations. He said in part, as a result of the smooth progress of the first phase operations, we have established an invincible strategic position. This position, however, cannot be maintained if we go on the defensive. In order to secure it tenaciously, we must keep on striking offensively at the enemy's weak points one after another. This will be the central aim of our second phase operations. Even while the Midway operation was being studied and rehearsed, developments which were to influence it profoundly were taking place nearly 3,000 miles away on the northeastern approaches to Australia. There, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inouye's 4th Fleet had launched the long-planned invasion moves toward Tulagi in the Solomons and Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea, which on the 7th of May precipitated the Battle of the Coral Sea. As originally planned in January, the Tulagi and Port Moresby invasions were to have been carried out shortly after the occupation of Lao and Salamaua in early March. However, the appearance in the southeast area of an American naval force estimated to consist of 2 fleet carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and more than a dozen destroyers had led combined fleet to defer the operation until 4th Fleet could be reinforced with a carrier division from the Nagumo force and some additional heavy cruisers. These reinforcements, consisting mainly of Carrier Division 5, Zuikaku, Shōkaku, and Cruiser Division 5, Myoko, Haguro, finally reached 4th Fleet's home base at Truk just before the end of April. In addition, Combined Fleet released the light carrier Shōhō to 4th Fleet Command for the operations. Since both Carrier Division 5 and Cruiser Division 5 were scheduled to take part in the later Midway operation, Vice Admiral Inouye lost no time in getting started. His operational plan called for the seizure of Tulagi on the 3rd of May, with the main assault on Port Moresby to be carried out a week later. The invasion convoys, staging out of Rabaul, were to be covered by 2 principal surface forces, one a close covering group composed of light carrier Shōhō, 4 heavy cruisers, and a destroyer, commanded by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. The other a carrier striking force made up of Zuikaku and Shōkaku, the 2 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 5, and 6 destroyers, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi. Under Takagi, carrier air operations were to be commanded by Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, Commander Carrier Division. The 2 forces sorted from Truk on the 30th of April and the 1st of May, respectively. The Tulagi landing was successfully carried out on the 3rd of May according to plan, and the next day the Port Moresby invasion force embarked from Rabaul in 14 transports escorted by 1 light cruiser and 6 destroyers. It had barely gotten underway, however, when enemy carrier aircraft delivered a severe attack on the Tulagi beachhead, sinking or damaging a number of small Japanese naval craft offshore. This gave warning of the presence of an enemy task force in the vicinity, and Vice Admiral Takagi's carrier striking force, which was still some distance north of the Solomons, promptly headed south at high speed to locate and engage the enemy. The Port Moresby convoy, not yet in danger, continued on its way, closely covered by Rear Admiral Goto's force. By the morning of the 6th of May, the Takagi force had skirted around the southeastern extremity of the Solomons and entered the Coral Sea, but it was not until the next day that it finally made contact with the enemy. At dawn on the 7th, search planes were launched from the carriers, and shortly thereafter one of them radioed back that it had sighted an enemy task force, including 1 carrier, about 160 miles south of the Japanese position. The entire attack strength of Zuikaku and Shōkaku, a total of 78 bombers, torpedo planes and fighters, immediately took off to attack. But when they reached the reported enemy position, they found that the task force actually was only a large oiler escorted by a single destroyer. The 2 ships, later identified as Neosho and Sims, were subjected to a fierce attack, which sank the destroyer and left the oiler heavily damaged and afire, with its crew abandoning ship. Only a short while after the attack groups had taken off and headed for their objective. Rear Admiral Hara, commanding the air operations, received reports from search planes of the Goto force, strongly indicating that the earlier sighting report had been erroneous, and placing the enemy carrier group to the southeast of the Louisiade archipelago. It was too late, however, to divert the attack, and a precious opportunity to strike the first blow at the enemy carriers was lost. The failure proved costly for the Japanese forces, for while the Zuikaku and Shōkaku air units were busy attacking Neosho and Sims, planes from the enemy carriers discovered a much more worthwhile target. Vice Admiral Inouye, commanding the overall Japanese operations from Rabaul, had already ordered the Port Moresby transport group to retire northward until the threat from the enemy carriers was eliminated. It was executing this order, covered by Rear Admiral Goto's force, when, at 11 a.m. on the 7th, a force of nearly 100 American bombers and torpedo planes spotted the covering group and delivered a fierce attack. The enemy aircraft concentrated almost entirely on light carrier Shōhō, which was heavily hit, and went to the bottom at 11:35 a.m. By the time the attack groups of Zuikaku and Shōkaku were ready to take off again, it was late afternoon, and Rear Admiral Hara felt that it would be too risky to send his full strength against the enemy carriers, as the pilots would have to find their way back and land in darkness. Still, he was eager to strike as quickly as possible, and therefore decided to launch part of his strength for a dusk attack, using only picked crews trained in night operations. At 4:30 p.m., a force of 27 bombers and torpedo planes took off and headed for the enemy's estimated position. It failed, however, to spot the carriers, and instead had the misfortune to run into an enemy fighter patrol, losing several planes in the ensuing dogfight. The remaining planes turned back and, on their way, passed right over the enemy carriers without being able to attack because they had already jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes. Before dawn the next day, the 8th of May, the Takagi force again sent out float planes to look for the enemy, and at 8:24 a.m. they radioed back that they had spotted the American carrier group bearing 205 degrees, 235 miles from the Japanese force. The group was reported to include 2 carriers and 1 other large unit, probably a battleship. Zuikaku and Shōkaku immediately launched their full attack strength, aggregating about 70 bombers and torpedo planes. At 11:20 a.m. the attack groups arrived over the target and began their assault against strong anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. The attack was highly effective, though not the total success that the reports of the returning flyers led Admirals Takagi and Hara to believe. According to these reports, both enemy carriers, one mistakenly identified as Saratoga, actually Lexington, and the other correctly as Yorktown, had been sent to the bottom, and a battleship or cruiser had been damaged. The actual results, not known to the Japanese until much later, were that Lexington, though not sunk in the attack, was so heavily damaged that she had to be abandoned and finished off by torpedoes from her destroyer escort later the same day. While Yorktown sustained a single bomb hit, which, though it caused considerable damage, did not put her out of action. In the meantime, the Takagi force also underwent attack by the air groups of the American carriers. The enemy planes, which were on their way at the same time that Japanese planes headed for Lexington and Yorktown, appeared over the Takagi force at 10:50 a.m. and continued attacking until 12:20 a.m. Zuikaku managed to elude the attack by heading into a rain squall which hid her from the enemy pilots, but Shōkaku, absorbing the full fury of the assault, sustained 3 direct bomb hits which rendered her incapable of continuing flight operations. Consequently, Shōkaku was ordered to withdraw, and Zuikaku had to recover the planes of both carriers. The tide of battle now appeared to have veered strongly in favor of the Japanese, for despite the loss of Shōhō and damage to Shōkaku, Zuikaku remained unharmed, whereas both of the American carriers were believed to have been eliminated. This seemed to present an excellent opportunity for the Takagi force to continue the offensive and complete the enemy's destruction. At about 5 p.m. on the 8th, however, Vice Admiral Inouye at Rabaul suddenly ordered the striking force to break off the action and retire, following this up a short while later with a further order postponing the Port Moresby invasion and directing the transport group to put back to Rabaul. The reason for the 4th Fleet commander's decision apparently was his estimate that, although the American carrier group had been crushed, the carrier air strength remaining on the Japanese side was insufficient to protect the invasion force against land-based air assault.